Oh, the work I do mainly involves working in the hotels that you've seen a lot in the news, I'm guessing. Is my screen sharing now?
Yep, that's all good. Yeah.
Can you see the slides? Yeah. Nice. Okay, cool. So, yeah, so I work a lot in those hotels that you see a lot in the news nowadays. And this should be full screen, but it's not. Um, whoops. Yeah, okay, anyway. So, yeah, I work in the hotels generally, and I used to volunteer 1 day a week at the RMC, the Refugee and Migrant Centre, which is in the Jewellery Quarter in Birmingham. Obviously, volunteering isn't accessible for everyone. Um, But if you work part time or if you're a student, all that involved was 1 weekday a week. So again, like I said, it's not very accessible. But if it is for anybody here, I would um, I would recommend that. I learned a lot from that, and that's how I first kind of got into the sector. Um, and yeah, as you can see from the slide, I've called this towards an Islamic perspective. Now, that's because I'm not myself a Muslim. So figuring out the Islamic perspective will actually be up to all of you. I just want to share from my experience and work and perspective. And I'm not any kind of expert, really. I just work in the field. And I've been over in Calais for a few months. So I thought I'd share my experiences and stuff. And that might hopefully spark some ongoing conversations and interest. And I'm also happy to be in ongoing contact, especially for young Muslims who want to get involved in the sector in any way whatsoever. I also assume there's probably already people here who are quite involved in the sector in various ways. That might be the case, but I've planned it to try and be as suitable as it can for someone with very little knowledge, except what they hear in the media. So don't feel insulted. Anyway, so just to start, I wanted to ask if anyone recognizes that mosque. No? So if I say it's the Mosque of the Companions, does that tell anybody where it is? Okay. So that's in Eritrea, and one of the service users that I've met through work, and he's not really a service user of the charity anymore, he's a friend. He actually told me that it's the first mosque in the world. I fact checked that it's not true, but it's potentially the first mosque in um, Africa, and it's where some of the earliest Muslims went. It's called Masjid al Sahaba. It's where some of the earliest Muslims went um, during the first Hijrah. I think I've pronounced that right, but maybe I'm not. Anyway, so that's that. Sorry, I forgot to plug my laptop in. Just give me a sec. So that's that. One sec. Okay. Also, can you hear me fine? Is that all fine?
Yeah, that's good.
Cool. Okay, and then next slide. So the reason I thought this was particularly relevant is because events earlier this year have obviously made it very clear to all of us that the fate of asylum seekers in this country and the position of Muslims in this country and safety of both populations is very intertwined. The blurred out bit there says the P word, and this is a hotel in Tamworth that was targeted during the riots. And when a hotel in Rotherham was targeted, the P word was also chanted as part of a chant. I know this isn't nice stuff to talk about, but yeah. Um, and the point I'm trying to make there is that even though they're targeting asylum seeker hotels in those specific instances, the wording they were using made it very clear that they had hostility towards the community, Pakistanis, that are generally third generation, second generation migrants here. So that tells us this is about a little bit more than asylum seekers, but also that we need to see that this is an interconnected issue because the people that are hostile towards both populations do see it as interconnected. And obviously, mosques were also targeted in that wave of violence. Anyway, so as part of introducing myself, I also want to point out that the vast majority of people on this call will probably have personal histories of migration, and it's always worth reflecting on and channeling that. My own roots are in Punjab. I was born there, and it's where I identify with. And in 1947, people here may know, it was partitioned, and several of my family found themselves on the wrong side of a border that never existed before. And my grandma's own family, they walked from Rawalpindi to the Indian side of Punjab. They had a relatively lucky experience of partition, as people who've heard more about it may know. But anyway, the point here is that for me, it's never been hard to understand the fundamental point that modern borders aren't some kind of like natural geographic boundaries create, but they're instead actually artificial creations by politics and capital and by race, and in this case, also by caste dynamics. And if you look at a world map and you look at all the straight lines, you can tell there's similar stories all over the world. Um, yeah, it's also worth pointing out that a couple generations of my own ancestors and many people in this call, they would have been British subjects before independence of the relative colonies. Um, that, however, didn't in itself give anyone any right to Britishness after the 60s or so. Yeah. So next slide. Yeah, so I just thought I'd debunk some terminology first. So illegal immigrant is a term that we hear a lot in the media, and it's not actually a very helpful term because it can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different cases. And I'll try and give some examples of that through the best way to understand the difference between asylum seeker and refugee is through a case study, like a fictional one. What the difference is basically when someone first arrives on British soil, that's when they can start an asylum claim. Once they've started an asylum claim, they're then put in temporary accommodation, which isn't what it's made out to be. They're not in five-star hotels getting room service. It's actually quite horrible. But that's not really covered in the media that much. And yes, a lot of money is spent on that, but the bulk of the money for that temporary accommodation goes to the hotel owners and agencies that find the hotels. And what's also not covered very often is that a lot of the hotels, in fact, all three of the ones that I work in, were actually failing hotels before this scheme was released. And security officers at one of these hotels have told me that three of the hotels that he works at and his mate works at were actually hotbeds of prostitution before they were taken over by the Home Office for this, because there was no other use for those hotels. Anyway, so that's a bit of a tangent. Anyway, so when someone first arrives, they'll start an asylum claim. And the horrible thing is you can't start an asylum claim until you're in Britain, like physically, or you're at the port. Then you can start an asylum claim. And that's why people are entering illegally. So there's a lot of people that are illegal immigrants for a couple of hours, for a day. Some people, they'll enter illegally, they'll make it all the way to a city where they've got a family, they'll go and visit them, they'll sort of settle for a bit, and then they'll find out what they're supposed to be doing, and they'll go and make an asylum claim. They are not criminals, no criminal charges are pursued against them, but they have been illegal immigrants for months. And that's quite a lot of people. Anyway, so then once you've made your asylum claim, you're not eligible for benefits. You're not eligible for university education. You're not eligible for work until you've been here for a year. And in fact, that's a lot of what I end up doing in the week as part of my job is helping people fill out the right to work forms, which if you've been in the asylum process for a year, which used to be very common, is now becoming quite rare, thankfully. Then you can then after a year apply for the right to work. But until then, you're literally not allowed to work. So they're only then, once they've had their interview with the Home Office, where basically the Home Office asks them their whole life story, everything about them, and they're expected to give very precise details. And they'll be failed just on giving any contradictory information. After they've had the interview, they may have two, they may have three interviews, sometimes months apart. Then they can gain refugee status. Only at that point are they eligible for benefits. They can then work any job they're able to get and various other things. Only at that point. So at that point, they've already proved that their asylum claim was valid and that they were fleeing something legit. So what they have to prove, for example, is that they're fleeing a country where there's warfare, they're not safe, etc., but that actually they are from that country. So a lot of Eritreans are asked to prove they're from Eritrea, not from Ethiopia, for example. A lot of Iranians are asked to prove they're not from Iraq, things like that. Same for Libyans. A lot of them are asked to prove they're Libyan. Um, yeah, and then after 5 years of being a refugee, they can then start to become a citizen. There's now all kinds of barriers to becoming a citizen. Um, but generally, with support, they manage to surmount those, and after 5, 6 years, they'll become a refugee in British law, in the eyes of British law. Then they can apply for family reunion, which is very important because you'll see in the media, you'll see pictures, you'll see front page headlines about how it's all men that are coming. Well, that's because the journey to get here is extremely dangerous. And once men have come here, they've done all this, they've gotten refugee status, hopefully within a year, then they can apply for their family to be able to come here directly because they're sponsoring them. And that's what a lot of people do. That takes up a lot of charity resources as well, is helping people apply for family reunion because it's not a very safe journey for women to make. And when we do meet um, asylum seeker who is a woman or a child, they're generally carrying a lot of trauma from everything the journey involves. And obviously, a big thing they're asked to prove is that they're not economic migrants, which is a term you'll see a lot. And we'll cover why that's a bad thing briefly. Um, and the issue with that is sometimes when people haven't been briefed, when they've not sort of had people like my workplace explain to them what they should be proving in the asylum interview, they might be coming from a war-torn country where there's all kinds of stuff going on. And they'll be asked, why did you come here? If they say, I came here for a better life, or I came here to feed my family, to make money, to send money back, they'll be failed because they've made themselves an economic migrant. They have to play into the narratives and say, I came here because my country is so bad. So they only have to talk about what is called the push factors and not the pull factors, if I've got it the right way around. So yeah, that's that. Yep. So that's the Refugee Convention, just a small quote from it. And Britain's a signatory to this. If we weren't a signatory to this, I reckon Britain wouldn't even be allowing, because Britain does everything that we can to not allow people to actually become refugees here. If we weren't a signatory to this, I reckon we wouldn't even allow it. But as you can see, there's only these factors: race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion. Only those can make you a refugee. Economic collapse in your country, or even the land becoming infertile or anything like that, and you're a farmer, those are not covered. And that causes a lot of problems. Anyway, so that's that. So I'll try and speak more about things like Calais and my work and how we can help, because that's what I'm actually more qualified to speak about. I'm not an immigration expert. So for that, I'll recommend some resources that you can look at. So Calais is where, to be honest, my eyes are opened in a lot of ways. And how I ended up there is because, like I said, I've been volunteering at the RMC. Before I'd been volunteering at the RMC and throughout volunteering at the RMC once a week, I'd been involved off and on with Palestine Solidarity stuff. And someone I met through Palestine Solidarity stuff had told me about what was going on in Calais and the charities that are doing work there. And yeah, it always in the back of my head was very appealing. And then when October happened, like we all know how all of us felt really. By December, I was feeling very disillusioned that nothing seemed to be working and just that it was still carrying on. And then I saw that the charity my friend had been with had a shortage of volunteers. So I was like, you know what? The opportunity to help with something very directly, very materially, and very nearby. Like getting to Calais is 20 quid on the coach from London if you have citizenship and stuff and you can cross borders very easily, which most of us in this school probably can. So I was like, you know what? Maybe this will make me feel a bit less disillusioned with everything that's going on. And what was going on in Calais is that until 2016, there was a lot of media attention. That's why some of you might have heard of Calais. If you've not, it's a town in northern France. It's the nearest town to the English shore. And it's actually one of the places where the English border really is. Sometimes it's made out as though the English border is the channel and the body of water itself. That's a complete lie, and it's an intentionally created lie. The border is actually in northern France. That's where the border force checks people. That's where there's a very expensive police operation paid for by the British taxpayer to basically beat people up who are trying to come here. So that's the border. And there was a jungle here, which is what everybody called it, which was basically like you could call it a shanty town or a slum. And there was housing, if you can call it that. There was a makeshift mosque, makeshift shops, churches, and different communities all living together. And these were people who were trying to either come to Britain or they were considering coming to Britain and had ongoing asylum cases in France. In 2016, Britain and France worked together to dismantle this. And then the media promptly forgot all about the jungle. Um, Not about the jungle, sorry, about Calais and the fact that people move through there. But people are still going through Calais to come to Britain because, like I said, you have to actually be in Britain to start an asylum claim here. There's no visa to come here like there is for skilled workers like my mother or any other sort of route. You have to come here one way or another. And retrospectively, however you got here, more or less becomes legal. But they're trying to change that now. But yeah, and what it is now is there's very disparate camps, and it's just tents, rough sleeping, of people pushed on the outskirts of the city. And there's a lot of hostile architecture in the city. So if you go to Calais, it's a really weird place because any open bit of grass that isn't a public park that's got security and stuff has big, heavy stones so that people can't put tents up. And unlike the jungle, there's no structures now. There's just tents because there's a regular eviction operation that Britain pays for, which is basically that every 2 days, the police go from each camp, and about half the time they'll beat somebody up. Each time they'll confiscate a tent or two. They'll say that everybody living in that camp has to move 50 meters, and they'll rip tents open. We've got eyewitness testimony that they'll urinate on people's tents. They'll rip open bin bags and throw them around. This is all very well documented. I've witnessed a lot of this myself. And there's a charity working specifically around this as well. So that's called the evictions operation. And the reason Britain pays for this is because France would be more than happy for every asylum seeker to just go to Britain. Um, that's in Calais. Obviously, there's a huge population of asylum seekers that have no interest in ever coming to Britain, and they just stay in South France, Central France. They never come towards Calais. I don't want to make it sound like everybody wants to come here because that's absolutely not true. Um, so yeah, that's Calais. There's issues with food and water access. Water access is a big issue. And obviously, people are crossing using boats. There's normally a lot of people on each boat because it's very expensive and people are broke. Um, and the reason they're using boats is because, like I said before, there's no safe routes. And maybe it goes without saying, but there's no Ukrainians in Calais because for Ukrainians, there was a safe route. After years of telling us that there's no safe routes, suddenly there was. And there hasn't been for anybody since. There was the Arab scheme for Afghans, but that fell apart. Um, Europe likes to blame smuggling gangs for all the people that are crossing the Mediterranean and crossing in Calais. And a lot of people die in both crossings. And the governments always blame smuggling gangs. But the war on drugs has taught British and European and American governments, especially, that where there's demand, there's going to be supply. And if they can't even stop the flow of drugs through Calais, I don't think they're going to stop something as natural as migration. Um, and they failed to do so far, and they've tried a lot of different things. And yeah, just a bit of a personal anecdote, just because of some of the conversations I had with a lot of the populations there, and just a lot of things that I discussed and saw. It was also where I became much more in touch with sort of religion and things like that. Yeah, and interestingly, Calais was formerly part of England for quite a while, um, which shows how flexible the border is. Can people see that? Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. So when we talk about safe routes, like just look at that. Um, okay, so I was part of a charity called Calais Food Collective, which is part of Calais Appeal. And Calais Food Collective was set up to have a different approach to food distribution. Because if I'm brutally honest, a lot of the guys in the camps, they didn't really enjoy the food that they were being cooked and distributed by British charities. You can read between the lines about the cooking and stuff there. So what Calais Food Collective did is we would just give people raw ingredients, cooking equipment, and like oil, and just let them cook to their own cultural tastes. Because, for example, Afghans will make flatbread with wheat, but Sudanese will boil wheat to make something called asida. So we didn't want to like cater to one taste over another or anything like that. So we would empower people by just giving them cooking equipment and stuff like that. And we'd work with a charity called Woodyard, who would distribute firewood. They spend their days chopping wood and distributing it for firewood. And Calais Appeal is a collective of grassroots charities that all fundraise together and work together on things like campaigns. Calais Food Collective no longer does food distribution because the water project got too expensive and because the funding is not enough to cover both. And the water project is actually really important because it's also a campaign because we would collect data on how many liters, and it was in the hundreds of water that we would give out every day for people to brush, wash, cook, drink, because that's all information on how much France isn't adhering to its own legal agreement to provide water for anybody in France. And this is water is a human right, and that's why if you don't pay your water bill, it's very hard for a water company to cut you off, which you might not know, but that is the case. So if you're ever running out of money, the water bill is the last thing to prioritize. um, but yeah, France did agree to the campaign, but they never implemented it. That was an update I just got today. Actually, I asked the people I used to work with about that. And if anybody's ever interested in going to volunteer in Calais, by the way, usually charities will provide accommodation because that's what a chunk of the funding goes to, is accommodation for volunteers. And something else I was involved in for just one day is human rights observers who document what the police do in that operation I described before. And not only they document it, they also kind of intervene by watching, by being present. And when a French speaking white person is there, a lot of the people in the camps told us that the police behave very differently. But even then, on the day I was there, a police officer forced me and the French speaking white person that I was with to move very far away on no legal basis when we weren't talking to anybody, we weren't interacting with the police, we were just witnessing. And then we did that. And then later, on their way out, after doing what they always do on the evictions, they threatened to chain specifically me to a bin. And I mean, you can guess why they made that threat specifically to me. Project Play also does a lot of documentation work because they work with children in the camps, and they've worked with Amnesty International to collect information on how many children are being let down in the camps. CFC is currently doing an emergency fundraiser, by the way. But if you're going to donate, I would recommend donating to Calais Appeal because those funds are distributed equally between the charities. Something that also I found very touching is that in Calais, there's a network of safe houses which are run by various Christian groups and churches in the area. And those safe houses, one of them is for families that are on the move, because obviously there's specific challenges for living in the tents and the camps if you're a family. And one of them is for people that have been injured while in the camps. And I volunteered there for a day, and most of the injuries were from the police. Um, and it was actually a really nice experience. You really learn a lot. You meet a lot of very amazing and beautiful souls. And the resilience and the level of faith as well, I have to say, of the people that are on the move and about to risk their lives by crossing is really touching. These are some organizations that are doing really good work in Birmingham. Brushstrokes and St. Chad's. So I work for Brushstrokes. Them and St. Chad's are part of Father Hudson's, which is a Catholic, loose sort of like confederation of charities in Birmingham. They actually run houses as well that are funded by Irish building companies. And those houses are for newly granted refugees. One of them's only for women. And that's just to help people get on their feet, find jobs, and then move into their own housing. So that's this is just to give an idea of the kind of work that's going on. At Brushstrokes and St. Chad's Sanctuary, they give out clothes, there's English classes, social activities, communal meals. Bike fixing is something I volunteer with once a month. If anybody wants to get involved, we train people as well. And I've got to shout out, a lot of work is being done by sort of small churches, mosques, local faith centers, and community centers. And Birch Network is worth Googling. They do really cool work. I'm not going to get into it here. And Restore do really important work with befriending, which I wouldn't underestimate the importance of befriending. That's a very easy way that anyone can help refugees and asylum seekers because they're very isolated. They don't get to practice English, and they don't know how to navigate life in England. Life in England, sorry. So yeah, that's just a bit of an overview of what's going on in Birmingham. The Refugee Migrant Centre is amazing, but they're very stretched. So there's normally a queue for the Refugee and Migrant Centre in Jewellery Quarter from 6:30, 7:30 onwards. They're open at 9. So that's how much in demand their service is. And that's just advice work, like helping people fill out forms, employment advice, making applications, things like that. And yeah, this is just some ideas on how you can help locally. Data bank is worth being aware of. Anyone, no matter your background, British citizen, whatever your income, you can look on data bank website online, Good Things Foundation, and you can get SIM cards. And yeah, these are just different ways you can help locally. Employment is a big one, you know. In the media, it makes it sound like nobody wants to work and this and that. But actually, we have an employment team at Brushstrokes, and that is the most in-demand service um, from refugees, that is, not from asylum seekers because they can't work, but from refugees, that is the main thing. Because obviously they want to send remittances back home to their families, to their countries, and they want to be able to make money beyond just benefits to do that. So there's some schemes that Irish building companies and stuff are running for specific like schemes for people to have their first job in the country and stuff like that. So if anyone knows any business owners, then that's a really big way you can help. And I can put you in touch with the relevant charities as well. Oh, also, I forgot to mention, if anyone here is interested, I spoke to St. Chad's Sanctuary a couple of weeks ago, and they said if anyone of any faith background wants to just see what they do in a day, anyone here is welcome to go and shadow them, to just sort of help out with their English class, anything like that. So just get in touch with me or just go by to their building. And that would be good as well. And you know, there's a lot you can do just in your personal lives in terms of being aware and spreading that awareness, because there's a lot of stuff that people don't know about the situation. So these are some of the people that I meet on a daily basis. The first 3 are the largest group I meet, the first 4, sorry. And in the brackets, I've just given a small overview of how all of these backgrounds are backgrounds that I think Britain has some level of responsibility to. And a lot of these people's ancestors will have been British subjects, especially Sudanese, especially Kurdish. And I mean, with Afghanistan, it makes me very, very angry because a lot of the people coming here who are met in the camps as well are people who are leaving their country because they're seen as traitors because they worked with Britain during the occupation. And yeah, we meet a lot of Iraqis, and obviously the invasion of Iraq was illegal. So if Britain's not going to do anything for them, who is it going to do anything for? And yeah, so that's that. This is just an overall perspective of the global displacement sort of crisis going on right now. All the stats are pulled from the UNHCR, who are in charge of refugees. It's from their Global Trends report. I'm just going to name some countries: Sudan, Afghanistan, Syria, um, Somalia, Yemen, and all the Kurdish territories. Um, Eritrea and Ethiopia are Christian majority but sizable Muslim populations. I meet a lot of Kuwaiti Bedouin people, and globally that's a big, big issue. Bedouin means they're undocumented. The Kuwaiti state doesn't recognize them, so they're stateless people. They're a forgotten stateless population, really. There's also a lot of pressure on Muslim countries to host refugees because it's sometimes made out that refugees are all coming here. Well, actually, the vast majority of refugees go to their neighboring country. So that's Iran, Turkey, Pakistan are spending a lot of money on hosting refugees. I think 1 in 6 people in Lebanon are refugees, and it's something like 1 in 16 for Jordan as well. So, the Muslim world, the Ummah, is really facing the brunt of displacement globally. And one very sad fact is that Sudan actually hosted a lot of refugees, and so did Libya before the respective crises. And I've met people myself at work who have told me they would have never left Libya. And they're from this one guy was from Ethiopia, another guy was from Eritrea. They said they would never have left Libya, and they loved their life there as migrant workers, if not for the civil war there. And I could get into foreign intervention in Libya, but it's not that relevant right now. Yeah. So yeah, and Muslims are facing very specific issues globally as refugees. If you look at the Rohingya, they're mostly only being able to flee from Myanmar into Bangladesh because India passed legislation recently which said that they'll accept refugees of any religious background except Muslim, which also affects an internal population of Muslims from rural backgrounds who don't necessarily have documents, who are now being accused of being Bangladeshis or Rohingya. So, this is a global issue. But I just want to stress that you don't have to go all the way across the world. You don't have to go to Lebanon or Palestine to help refugees, to help asylum seekers. You can do it not that far from where we are right now, all of us. Um, and this is another issue that Muslim countries are facing. There's been reports recently that countries like Morocco, Libya, and Egypt are facing pressure to comply to basically beating up refugees on their southern borders and stop them coming into Europe in exchange for foreign aid. And of course, that foreign aid is colonial wealth that's being given back to them with conditions. So for this, I was hoping could be a bit less of just me talking. This is that same mosque again. Um, so I don't know if anybody wants to sort of give any perspective they have, because obviously I'm not Muslim and I have some vague ideas, but just in terms of if anything speaks to people in terms of like what the Quran has to say about refugees indirectly or directly, what the Hadith or just Islamic history. So I want to sort of open the floor to contributions, if that's all right.
I was just gonna say, it makes me think about the Prophet ﷺ and his migration from Mecca to Medina, um, and how, you know, the entire, again, in so many years ago, the Muslim population then was kind of scrutinized and boycotted. Um, and then also from the perspective of accepting refugees and accepting people who are fleeing for safety, it makes you think of the story of the Negus as well. Um, and you know, the I guess the I don't know, sometimes the beautiful connection that religion can have in these situations, because he was obviously from a Christian background initially. Um, yeah, there's just some reflections that I have.
Yeah, Hayan, go for it. No need to raise your hand. Oh, so I was thinking of the hadith of Islam began as something strange and will return to being something strange. So blessed are the strangers. And then the meaning of the word stranger in that hadith, which is ghuraba, which means like foreigners, like stranger in the sense of someone who's foreign to you, foreign to your land. And then so it kind of it's inside, like Islam is rooted in this notion of being a somewhat persecuted outsider group, and that's what like the asylum seekers and refugees are in our societies today, and it's our duty to send glad tidings upon them.
And I really like the idea of non-ownership, that actually we don't own land. It's almost like the American Indian concept. We don't own land. Land is owned by God. So who are we to own it and disown people from land as if we have some prior right to it? Wherever humans tread and wherever creation goes, they belong to the land of the creator. And all that matters is not your rootedness to the land through your ancestry, but your rootedness to God, and that this is God's creation.
That was all really valuable contributions. Thanks, everyone. And I just want to say as well that in Calais and in the hotels as well, the level of faith that I see um, from Muslims, but also from Christians, is really, really immense. But I mean, I think that's what I learned in the camps is that, especially when you're sort of facing injustice and stuff, that's when people are more likely to remember God as well. Or at least that's how it seemed. Um, so yeah. And a lot of those stories are very relevant. And some of those things I learned about during my time in Calais, including the fact that the Negus and Abyssinia, that's modern day Eritrea and Ethiopia. And it's a very cruel um, fate of twist of twist of fate that it's a people that are famous for having taken in refugees in the past that are now one of the largest displaced populations. But then it's also a sort of nice twist of fate that it's mostly Muslim countries that have taken them in. Um, oh, that's a very good question, Yusuf. It would shift week to week um, because obviously it's a very transient population through there. I think a good organization to ask would be Salam, um, or I think Alarm Phone, because Salam is a Muslim charity that works in Calais. I never worked directly alongside them, but we were always aware of them being around and being active. So they might have some idea of how many Muslims there are. I could ask CFC because we did do a special distribution for Ramadan, but that would be stats from months and months ago. Um, and a lot of people go missing because a lot of people not go missing, but a lot of people aren't covered in the stats because they're in small individual camps of 3 or 4 rather than larger ones. That's a very good question, actually. Um, I'd say there was a lot of Afghans when I was there, and they were all Afghans are the most sorry to generalize, but Afghans are the most proud Muslims that I've ever met. Like La ilaha illallah just rolls off their tongue at everything. Um, there's also a lot of Sudanese who are also very devout Muslim. Iranians are mixed because maybe like 5% of Iranians I've met are Muslim. A lot of them um, are now ex-Muslim, atheist, or Christian. And that's partly because that makes it very easy to gain asylum, and partly because of state policies um, and a mix of factors. But they are from a Muslim country, obviously, predominantly Muslim country. There's also, it's worth mentioning, there's not many Palestinians in Calais. I didn't meet a single Palestinian in Calais. Um, and I haven't talked about Palestinians much today, um, partly because obviously we're all aware of the fate of the Palestinian people. But I've got some other slides that I could just quickly zoom through. I only prepared them in case we have time. And then we'll do like a Q&A for 20 minutes or so, and just a discussion in general. So yeah, just this is a book I'd recommend. Great book. If anyone's interested in economics or politics or a student of anything along those lines, please look into global labor arbitrage. When I learned about this on a module about global north-south disparities, it changed just how I look at the world. And basically the concept is that we live in a very globalized world for business and business owners, and a very restricted world for everyone else. And that's by intention, because outsourcing and all the profits that are made by outsourcing your production to countries like, in this case, what I was learning about was Bangladesh, is only profitable if the Bangladeshi workers can't just move a few miles across to India. Because what the Bangladeshi factory owners said after the Rana Plaza collapse is that they can't give better working conditions for their workers because the companies that contract them, in the case of the Rana Plaza collapse, mostly British, European, and American companies, they say if you hire less staff per hour in the same building, or if you charge us more for the production cost by paying decent wages, we'll move to Vietnam, to India, to China. And they're able to play countries off like this because of the very rigid bordering system. And the bordering system is very, very, very modern. Like I've said a couple times, yes, boundaries exist, natural geographic boundaries exist, but these historical constructs, they are exactly that. They're just historical constructs. And they're constructed by police forces, specific policies, and they're also everywhere. So the border isn't just at Calais or over in the north of Ireland, where there's now going to be a huge argument over Brexit and about whether Northern Ireland is going to be part of Ireland or Britain, because there's an agreement already that people should be able to move across it. But also all the citizenship checks for work, for housing, they didn't used to exist about 10, 20 years ago. And if you've ever applied for a job recently, you'll know that you have to provide ID and stuff like that. Same for banking. Pretty much every aspect of British life now is a border, because they'll ask you for your citizenship status. And that didn't used to be the case before the hostile environment. Yeah.
Can I just, sorry,
Sorry, sir.
can I just add something? I mean, it strikes me that what you're describing is the exact opposite of what the European Union project sought to achieve, which is a breaking down of borders for economic prosperity for everyone within Europe. And yeah, I mean, it's the polar opposite of that. And it creates unnecessary restrictions and physical barriers for people to seek out better lives for themselves and their families. And unfortunately, even with the UK Brexiting from Europe, I mean, it's clear to see what consequences follow from that. And we see some of that in the UK. I mean, relatively speaking, we are economically well off, and it's not disastrous, but there are signs there as to how it's affected a lot of people amongst the working classes, and it's the wrong direction to be traveling in.
Yeah, no, you're completely right. My personal view is that the European project did have hypocrisy at its core as well, though, because it was freedom of movement for some people and not for others. And I think maybe we all know why Turkey isn't part of the European Union, but somewhere like Poland is. And also there is a quote from, I think, a European chancellor a couple of years ago, caused a lot of controversy by saying that Europe was the garden which needed high walls to keep the jungle out. Something along those lines. So yeah, but yeah, I completely agree with you. It goes against the whole sort of ideology of like free movement that the EU is supposed to be about. Yeah, and Frontex is worth Googling because of this. And this is still happening. The pushbacks are still happening. And Britain has pushed for this policy. Britain supports this policy because if Greece and Italy are killing refugees in the Mediterranean, then they're not going to get here. Do you know what I mean? So, yeah. This is, I mean, it's not worth going through here, but this is just a series of laws that have been passed to create the category of citizen. And each of them can be tied to a wave of racism in Britain. So the first one, 1905 Aliens Act, was a reaction against Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe. Then the 1962 Commonwealth Immigrations Act was against Commonwealth citizens from Caribbean countries, and particularly Hong Kong, being able to come here. And all of these increasingly tightened what a citizen is. The 1968 Commonwealth Immigration Act is probably very relevant for people here because this was basically pushed for by Enoch Powell, but it was passed by Labour. And it created an exemption for people that were British by ancestry, so white settlers in East Africa, but it sought to exclude Gujarati, Punjabi, and other South Asian populations that were being pushed out of East African countries. And they were only in East Africa to work for Britain. And they identified more with Britain than they do with India or Pakistan in some cases. And they were they're a population generally that is quite loyal to Britain. That's how you get Priti Patel and Rishi Sunak. Both of those are the descendants of that wave of migration to Britain. The 1981 British Nationality Act is something that comes up a lot at work. This removed the right to automatic citizenship by being born in Britain. So this is something that's constructed by history and recent history. The Life in the UK test that my mum had to pass, that wasn't introduced until the early 2000s. And it was introduced, what happened in 2001? Like, the documents haven't been declassified yet, but we know why that was introduced. And you can see the stats. And the Windrush scandal, I'd recommend people Google that. This book is very good. The Hostile Environment, I've mentioned it before. Please read about it. Vans that said go home were being sent around certain neighborhoods in London. Shamima Begum and everything that has created. The Institute of Race Relations, by the way, shout out to them. They do amazing work on the sort of knowledge side of things. They're not very active, they don't do anything, but they do a lot of very useful reports for on-the-ground activists and stuff. So yeah, I hope this kind of puts it very clear that the fate of asylum seekers and involvement with those that the border is most sharply affecting is really important for Muslim populations, because a lot of the increase in bordering is using either Islamophobia as an excuse or is specifically because of Islamophobia. So yeah, people can still see the slides, can't they? Yeah, cool. This is just an extended quote. We're at the Q&A discussion, whatever, but people can read that if they like. That's from the Institute of Race Relations report. People can talk amongst themselves. If you're sick of my voice now, I don't normally like to talk this much, I'd hope, but yeah. People have questions from my on the ground work. People have questions for each other. And also I want this to be a non-judgmental zone. So if you've heard things like, oh, why is it only men coming? Please feel free to ask. If you want to ask about the hotels, feel free to ask. Anything like that. I'm not going to judge you. I'm not going to think you're racist. This is where you should ask those things that you hear in the media or from your friends. Thanks for listening, by the way.
Can I ask a question, please? I do apologize because I was listening passively earlier on, so I may not have caught everything that was discussed earlier. But I heard you mention a charity by the name of Brushstrokes. Can I just ask what they do? Is it a charity that uses art as a form of therapy for refugees and asylum seekers? or am I mixing that up with another charity that I've heard about?
So we do have that as well. On Fridays, there's usually some kind of art lessons or music lessons, stuff like that. To be honest, it's an ongoing battle with management to get the name changed because it's called that because it was a paint factory or something. And then we took over the building and they called it that. And we get people turning up thinking it's to do with art, but it's we have an employment team, we have a refugee resettlement team that help people find housing once they've got status.
Okay.
I work in the outreach team, so my sort of base is the Brushstrokes building, but I'm in the hotels every day. We run social activities in the room. So there's film screenings at the end of every month, which people are always welcome to come to. That's for anyone. There's a community meal on Fridays as well, which is intended to be for people of different walks of life so that asylum seekers can practice English and integrate. All kinds of stuff. It's a full service charity. Upstairs there's a resources room. So if you have clothes, toys, bedding that you want them to go specifically and directly to refugees and asylum seekers, just drop them off whenever. But yeah, it's in Smethwick, the building.
Okay.
And our partner organization is St. Chad's Sanctuary in Birmingham. And I work for Brushstrokes, but I prefer St. Chad's because they refuse to take any state funding, whereas we do take state funding, and I don't like that, even though it pays my bills. So that's the whole thing. But yeah, thanks for asking.
No, that's fine. And one other thing that I would highly recommend, I did this years ago, but Islamic Relief ran this weekend survival camp. And what it allowed participants to do was to get a refugee experience. So we ended up spending a night sleeping in the cold. And as luck would have it, the weather was pretty bad, the ground was frozen. But that, as well as the role play that they put on over the weekend with, participants being channeled and treated as if they were literally fleeing a war zone, and soldiers were splitting families apart, and that kind of simulation, that had a sort of profound effect on me. I mean, I remember one situation where they were separating men from women, and at the time you were in the role play, so you were completely powerless. And that just got to me because I've got 3 daughters, a wife. At the time, my mother was alive. And I was just thinking, if this was real, how would I feel if, this was really going on? And as, coincidence would have it, when I returned from that weekend and got home, I discovered that some friends of ours further down our road, they'd actually taken in some Sudanese refugees to stay and live with them. So that whole kind of time, it just really opened my eyes to, the hardships and the experience that refugees and asylum seekers go through. And then to find that, there was literally refugees living on our road when I returned to London was a real kind of wake-up call and an eye-opener. So if anyone gets the opportunity to do that, I would highly recommend it.
No, thanks for sharing. And I guess that's kind of why going to Calais changed my life, just to see and to be able to relate. But that sounds like a really useful sort of role play, yeah. Imran has had their hand up for a while, and then Sarah had her hand up as well, and Yusuf. So if we go in that order.
Yeah, so thanks for the presentation. I just had a question that I hear quite a lot. It's like, so why do people actually come to Britain? Like, it's very easy to understand why people would flee their country, why they'd come to Europe. But like after you arrive in Germany, France, whatever, why do people, like pay huge amounts of money and take like literally risk their life in order to get to Britain and then also go through all these challenges? I mean, do they like, are they not fully informed about like the sort of challenges they'd face, or are there like other reasons that I guess they'd come here? Yeah, from like a relatively safe place like France, they're not going to, I don't think, be persecuted there. I mean, my understanding, but yeah.
Yeah, very good question, and that is a very relevant one. So, firstly, if you look at the report I quoted, um, the first thing always to point out to people when they ask this is that the vast, vast majority of refugees go to the neighboring country and stay in the neighboring country. Um, so one example would be we're getting more Afghan refugees coming to Britain now and across Europe because in Pakistan, where they'd been for years and years and years, they've now been pushed out by the new government or something along those lines. Um, but yeah, and when the Sudanese conflict started, that meant a lot of refugees that had been there for a very long time from nearby countries then got displaced into neighboring countries. I think it depends on the conflict, but in most conflicts, about 75% um, of um, people are just staying in the neighboring country. And then the second thing is if you look at the statistics, UK is taking some of the lowest proportion and population of refugees in the world. It's among the lowest, and even compared to um, mainland Europe. Sorry, so Germany, for example, takes a lot, and um, and why somebody in France and Germany would choose to come here is a very important question. Sometimes, yes, they are misinformed. They face challenges in France and Germany that they think they won't face here as much. To some extent, they're right, but for a lot of them, it's because they have connections here. So Yemeni community, for example, there's been Yemenis in Birmingham since the 1920s, 1930s. So for them, they know if they come here, they've got family contacts, they've got community spaces. There's the Muath Trust in Balsall Heath. People know about these things often before they come here. Some of them, they've got their cousin here who says, "Oh, I'll help you get a job once you're here," and they're struggling to get jobs in Germany or France. Other reasons, they might be from backgrounds where they've studied English and they don't want to have to learn French from scratch. That's something that people sometimes tell us. But often it genuinely is just that they don't see a life for themselves in Germany. And some families are split. So my colleague, for example, he's an Iranian. He's in Britain. The rest of his whole family is in Germany, and they have no intention of leaving Germany. But he's here in Britain. Just because he thought he'd have a better life here. And for me personally, I think that's perfectly fine. I don't think someone should have to stay in the first safe country they go through. And also, some countries aren't safe for some people. So a lot of people, when they get to France, they're like, this is where I want to be. I love this place. Or I'll put up with this place. Or this is the right place for me. For example, we don't get many Tunisian migrants. They all generally stay in France and they just go to France. So yeah, there's a lot to it, but often it's because of existing links, a country being a former British colony and hence having English in their education system, and being misled and thinking Britain has better systems or treats asylum seekers better, or that they'll process asylum claims faster. So there's a mix of factors. Yeah. But for me, it's if someone's telling you, oh, they shouldn't be coming to England, what I would say to them is, why should they not have that right? Why should somebody have to go? When Jewish people were being forced to leave Russia in the late 1800s and early 1900s, many of them went to neighboring countries, but many of them also went to America. Many of them came to Britain. Some of them went to Israel. So do you know what I mean? Like in the past, whenever there's been refugee crises, that's just the way migration works. I hope that helps. But particularly in my experience, the Sudanese guys that want to come here, especially, it's because they already have some level of English and they have connections here. And also, to be honest, partly you can blame South Asians because if you talk to Muslims anywhere else in the world, in the non-Muslim world, sorry, in America especially, they'll tell you that being a Muslim is much better in England because of groundwork that the South Asian Muslim community put in in the 1940s, 1950s. You can't really get halal food as easily in other places. Like, I was stunned when I went to France and supermarkets don't even have hummus, let alone like anything like that. So yeah, it's stuff like that. People come here knowing about Balsall Heath. Somali people come here knowing about a small heath. I'm not joking, genuinely. So they won't know that they don't have access to this or that, but they'll know that. And one thing I will clarify is that a lot of people I meet, they have no idea what the NHS is. So they're not all coming here for that. So yeah. Anyway, so next I think was Auntie Sarah.
No, it's okay. Thank you. I'd rather everyone else asks. Thank you. Let the others ask. Thank you.
Yusuf?
Yes, thank you. Very informative session. Just a quick one. It seems like there's quite a lot of stuff happening around Birmingham, which is great for yourself and me as well. But quite a lot of people, campus and on this call and stuff, aren't really in Birmingham. So do you have any kind of contacts or charities, or did some of the charities that you work for and stuff? I see. Yeah. Brilliant. That's just what I was asking. Sorry if you answered this question before, and yeah.
No, yeah, that's a really good point. I only mentioned Birmingham stuff. There's a lot in it. There's actually more in other cities. There's no anti-raids network. There kind of is an anti-raids network in Birmingham, but it's more functioning in other cities. Anti-raids network, for people who don't know, that's more in solidarity with people who are undocumented. But when it was Rwanda and stuff like that, they mobilized very quickly. But these other organizations I've listed, they're national. Manchester has a lot of stuff going on in the sort of borders, migrant solidarity space. But yeah, I would check out this list as well, just for learning resources from like actual experts. And these are national as well. Right to Remain are very, very good because they work with grassroots groups in the whole country. So if you contact Right to Remain, I'd hope they'd be happy to put you in touch with local organizations. And one thing I wanted to say as well is there's a lot of work that, like your local mosques, they can do in terms of. One thing I'd say is if your local mosque has an Arabic class, ask them if they have an English class. And if they don't, then see if you know someone who'd offer to volunteer. So that's one example.
Cool. I think we've got a message in the chat from Hashim if you're happy to answer that.
Yes. Right, yes, okay. I see the question, yeah. That might be a good one to get other people's views on as well, but I'll give you my viewpoint. Okay, so if there's not enough space, then why is there space for Ukrainians? And secondly, asylum seekers and refugees, they're generally coming here to work, pay taxes, set up businesses, and do all those things. So that's an argument. It's not a very principled argument because I believe people should be allowed to live where they want regardless. But obviously, that is the reality. A lot of our high street businesses are run and staffed by asylum seekers and refugees. A lot of our industries rely on asylum seekers, refugees, and actually also people that don't have status, unfortunately. And wait, let me just read that. And also, just statistically speaking, the problem in Britain just isn't about space. In terms of how much land in Britain is developed, it's really low. Like how much land is built on here is actually really low. And even then, when you look at the housing crisis, the crisis has nothing to do with the amount of actual houses available. It's to do with chronic landlordism. That's meant that there's flats and buildings everywhere just sat empty. And or at least substandard as well. And resources wise, I mean, let's compare our corporate tax to other countries. You know, like the government is currently trying to tax on inheritance of land, and look what that's caused, if people have been following the news on that. So, you know, I just don't think that there's a credible argument that population and migration has anything to do with the resources in Britain being stretched. Of course, the NHS is falling apart. Of course, the welfare state in general is falling apart. But we have to look into why that's actually happening, what the root causes of that really are. And yeah, I mean, the cost of living, just look at the profit margins of the corporations that are crying about inflation and saying that we have to charge so much for baby food and whatever else. It just doesn't, like, the maths just doesn't add up, in my opinion. And wait, I think I'm looking at someone else's question actually. Sorry. Oh no, yeah, right, Maharsh. Okay, yeah, previous background checks. Yes, so I mean, yes, some asylum seekers have committed crimes of all kinds. Some migrants that have been here for generations have committed crimes of all kinds. But you know, what's the most publicly known rape case of the last sort of 5-6 years in Britain? It was a police officer in the most elite police force in London. Is anyone saying kick out all policemen from Britain? Do you know what I mean? So, and also background checks. I've seen this be said in the media. There's no proof. That's not true. While they're in the asylum process, they are undergoing background checks before they're made refugees. Yes, of course, they're then put in the hotels without the same extent of a full background check. And yeah, that's not safe. But I mean, that would be a good argument for the right wing or whoever to be making if a certain proportion of crime in Britain was being done by asylum seekers, but that just isn't the case statistically. I don't know if anyone else wants to say anything as well. I just saw a message pointing out about STAR. 100%. If you're a university student, please be involved with your university STAR or equivalent. But yeah, the stereotyping is really just false in my experience from working in the hotels. Like, you get a lot of young men saying they want to be volunteering, they want to be doing this, they want to be doing that. And I have a lot of colleagues who are women, and one of them is like completely comfortable going in the hotels on her own. Now there's a policy not to do that because of the riots, but she was completely comfortable doing that. She was regularly doing that, not had a problem even once. So, and one of the hotels I work at, the Serco staff is a young lady, one of the housing officers, sorry, and she's always chilling with the asylum seekers, playing Connect 4 with them. Do you know what I mean? So anecdotally, it's not a problem. In reality, of course, there's bad elements and there's no background checks. But when a British kid is born, no one's doing like some kind of like background check on, is this guy going to one day grow up to commit all kinds of crimes? And the bulk of crimes in Britain are done by people born here. So